wait, there we go.
I didn't know Bruce Wayne was afraid of bats.
Okay, so today we're debating the artist and the art. Can the art be separate from the artist? Can you hear me? Okay, let's go ahead and get into why. Now, Leo Tolstoy defines art as a human activity consisting in this, that one man consciously, by means of certain external signs, hands onto others feelings that he has lived through, and that other people are infected by these feelings and also experiencing them. Today, we're discussing the product of that activity, the art that's created in that activity. An artist, just to be clear, is someone who practices one of the various creative arts. This is a sculptor, novelist, poet, or filmmaker. That leads me to, now that we understand exactly what the resolution is saying, to my one point of resolutional analysis, which is that we're looking at art interpretation here. Now, it's very reasonable to say that we're looking at what happens, how we interpret and understand art. That's when we actually have this debate about whether an art can be separate from the artist. And I don't believe it can. And that's where my weighing mechanism comes in. Basically, analyze whether we can separate art from the artist based on whether it's going to harm our weighing mechanism of understanding. Now, basically, the point of art, the reason we have art is so that we can communicate ideas and so that other people can understand it. It's a way of communication, as Tolstoy says, passing on emotions and feelings to other people. And so with this in mind, the basic point I'm going to make is that in order to understand an art properly, we have to understand the artist. We can't separate the art from the artist, because the very point of art is to destroy the separation between the artist and the viewer and to communicate on a level that means we're sharing information and sharing feelings. I'm going to have a couple subpoints here. My first subpoint is that of the art equation. Now, we can picture art in terms of a basic equation. We can say something like the meaning of the art consists in the technique, the subject, the symbolism, the culture, and the intent, among others. That's how we understand the meaning behind art. My subpoint B is that without artists, we don't have understanding. Now, if you just look at art in isolation of the artist itself, what we're going to see is maybe something about culture, technique, perhaps in some cases even the subject. Probably not if you're looking at something like Cubist art, but you're going to miss a lot of stuff if you don't know the artist, if you don't understand the artist. But that leads to my third and final subpoint, which is that with artists, we have understanding. Tolstoy said again, the activity of art is based on the fact that a man receiving through his sense of hearing or sight another man's expression of feeling is capable of experiencing the motion which moved the man who expressed it. When we have the artist, we bring together all of the elements of art so that we can actually understand, see, and feel the subject, the meaning that the artist was trying to communicate to us. So basically, in order to understand and interpret art properly, we must know and understand the artist who made it. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic.
Okay, so Noah's laid out a great case on why it might be an easier way to appreciate art if we have additional information about its creator. But in terms of proving the resolution, which says that art cannot be separate from the artist, he hasn't done his job. The truth is, you can experience art separate from the artist. Noah can argue it's an inferior way, but it is still a possible experience of art. You can understand art even when you don't know the artist. That doesn't mean that it's impossible to understand it. It just means that you understand it more when you have the artist's information behind it. This is the summation of the composition. So let's go down his arguments. First, he says art is just when one man consciously gives his feelings. This is a very poetic definition. I just want to point out that art is not just simply feelings. It is the product of those feelings that we can see. Usually, a product that is designated by evoking an emotional reaction. That's the most common definition of art understood. So again, we don't disagree, but it is possible to view art as its own product. It's not something that's only just the feelings of its creator. He says we're talking about art appreciation. This is totally true. He gives his criterion of understanding. So here's the issue with the criterion of understanding, is that it applies to both sides of the resolution. You can understand art even when you've never seen its creator. For example, let's say that we see a great film about, some abstract film about a man who goes from rags to riches, and we don't know the director, we don't know who made it. We might later find out after we watch the film that the director of that film had a really rough childhood, and that makes the film a lot more meaningful, as Noah has described. However, the resolution is asking if art can or it cannot be separate from the artist. What Noah said is that it's a superior way to experience art when we know additional details about its background, but it does not mean that we can. Let's get down argument about the art equation, once again, cross-apply the same response: possible experience versus superior experience. This is not a question of what is a better way to experience art. It's a question of, can art be separate from the artist? Noah has already illustrated and said, yes, it can. Let's get down to my main contention, and that's of varied experiences. Because people experience art in different ways, they can separate art from the artist themselves if they don't have information about the director or the artist behind it. As we've already mentioned before, it's completely possible. Let's say that we're archaeologists. We find a great work of art from an ancient society. We will never know the artist. What Noah would essentially tell you by his own framework is that it is impossible to understand that art. We can't do anything with it. We can't experience it. We can't interact with it. Now, I agree with Noah that it'll become more meaningful once we know the artist, but the statement that we cannot learn anything about it simply because we don't know the artist isn't true. We can understand it to a degree. We can also understand art that we know the artist about, but the claim that we cannot separate the two is false.
Okay, so let's talk about the arguments that have been brought up so far. Now, my opponent says, first of all, that we can experience art apart from the artist, basically saying that we can understand and see art. The problem with this is that we can't really experience art and its meaning without understanding the artist. And this is true because we have examples, and I was going to bring some of these up, where we do have some place where we never know the author, and now, as Tolstoy said, the reason we have art, the goal of art, is so that the author can create a message that's later understood by people. Like, the whole point of art is going to be that we create this goal, create this piece of work that later communicates this message, communicates this feeling. The problem is, we don't have the artist, we don't have the meaning. And this is where we are going to get into a little bit. So my opponent says, in response to the whole idea of understanding, that we can understand parts of art, it's just an issue of possible experience versus superior experience. My response is missing the experience. When we don't have the artist, when we don't understand the why, when we don't understand the who behind the art, we're going to be missing out on stuff inherently. That's just completely unavoidable. We're going to be missing out on something. And when we're missing out on something, we're not experiencing that art, and we're not experiencing art. So let's talk about the whole point he brought up about the varied experience and how people just understand different art different ways. Now, the first response to this is that it's not the goal of art. The goal of art is not to say, here's this thing that we can interpret in all these different ways. The goal of art is to have this thing that we can interpret in the one way that the author intends it to be made. That's the point. The artist wants to communicate a message. The goal of art is to communicate that message, not to communicate, here are all these various different things that you could learn from this piece. That's not the reason that we have art. My opponent goes on to talk about how there's ancient archaeological stuff, and we could have this thing. But we do have this thing. Let's talk about the Odyssey. Now, the Odyssey is a piece written by an anonymous author known as Homer. We don't know who he was, what he was like, what he was trying to communicate, even besides just what we have in the Odyssey. And we're inherently missing out on a ton of information about Homer because of that. We're missing out on a ton of information about the work. We don't know, like, really, we can understand some of the point, but we can't understand the whole point. We can't get all the emotions and all the feelings because we don't know who Homer was. We understand perhaps some of the technique, the culture, some of the subject, but we miss all the intent and the symbolism that's inherent in that work, and that we can only understand when we understand the author himself. So the point is, the goal of art is to communicate a message, not just perhaps some idea that can be interpreted in various ways, but to communicate a message. And without the author, we can't get that message. Passing the mic.
Yeah, have you seen the movie The Princess Bride?
Yes, I have.
Did you like it?
I did like it.
Who directed? Oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, who directed that film?
I am not sure. I read it. I watched it a long time ago, back before I really cared about that stuff.
That omission is the reason you guys should vote con. Noah is able to appreciate, experience, and admire art even when he does not know the artist. That is enough of a concession for you to look towards this side of the table, proverbially, and vote. I can't really think of a more basic way to admit the flaw of the pro case outside of that admission, but I will further I will further elaborate on that as we go through his arguments. So again, Noah's core argument here is saying, well, the ideal way to experience art, in my opinion, is by knowing all this stuff about the artist behind it. But the fact is, the resolution isn't asking what's the most ideal way to experience art. Remember, all of Noah's arguments have to come back and prove the resolution true. He can't simply keep talking about why art's better this way or why he likes art more this way. He has to come back and actually prove that it is not possible to separate the art from the artist. And so he's using language that's really coded in idealism, like when he says things like, well, you can't really experience the art. In other words, translated, you can't experience the art in the way I consider to be ideal once you separate the two. And, I'm not here to disagree that additional information about the film's backstory might make the film better, but that's not the question of the topic. The question of the topic is, can we interact with art? Can art exist on its own if it is separated from the artist? And by the fact that Noah has appreciated a film that he has not, known the director of and can't remember even now, makes it true. Additionally, too, if you ever walk out before the credit scenes of a film are finished, you are voting for the con side. Like, that action literally says, I'm not really interested in who the artist is. I know that I appreciated the art by itself. Now, like, if you want to be a huge nerd and you want to memorize everyone's name, go through and know who all the PAs were and watch like the 4-hour behind the scenes thing, like, that's up to you. And that's exactly like, by the way, like what all the nerds will tell you. They'll be like, well, you're not really appreciating the art unless you go into all the backstory. But both you and I know that you can still separate the two, that you can still appreciate the two individually, even if it's not to their ideal appreciation or even Noah's ideal of appreciation. It is still a possible separation. And that's an argument that Noah just hasn't dealt with. He's dealt with the fact that it's better to experience art when we know more information, that it's better to pay respect to the artist's feelings, but he hasn't come down to that core issue of possibility, that we can still separate it. The fact that he's seen The Princess Bride and not known the director, producer, etc., I think that illustrates it.
Okay, so this speech is going to be pretty brief. Let's start out with a quote from Tolstoy again, because Tolstoy is awesome, and he wrote a whole ton about this topic. He says, the chief peculiarity of this feeling is that the receiver of a true artistic impression is so united to the artist that he feels as if the work were his own and not someone else's, as if what he expresses were just what he'd been long wishing to express. A real work of art destroys in the consciousness of the receiver the separation between himself and the artist. Not that alone, but also between himself and all whose minds receive this work of art. So the point that Tolstoy is making here is that we can't separate the art from the artist, because the whole point of art is to destroy the separation between the artist and the viewer. The goal of art, as we pointed out, and as I pointed out on multiple occasions, my opponent has responded to this, is to communicate a message, is to have this intent, this meaning behind it, that the author imbues with it. The artist imbues in the art this point. And if we don't understand the artist, if we're lacking this critical information about the meaning, then we can't understand that art. This isn't an issue of not understanding it enough or not appreciating it enough. It's an issue of missing the very point of the work. So my opponent says something like, I am able to understand art without knowing the artist, like The Princess Bride. I'm still missing something. I'm still missing the goal of that work. That's the point I'm making here. He says that when you have this, I'm just talking about the ideal experience here. I'm not talking about the actual experience. But my point is, when we're missing the goal, that's far from ideal. That's tragic. When you miss the goal of the experience altogether, then you have a lot of problems. What we need to be looking at is what actually achieves the goal. And when this doesn't achieve this goal, we see indeed that it can't separate the art from the artist. And so my opponent has talked a lot about films, and he basically says, if I don't watch the full credit scenes of the movie, then you're basically voting con. Now, I would disagree, because when you talk about an artist, you aren't necessarily talking about all of the extras in the movie or any of those people who just did sound editing. You're talking about the person behind the creative force of the movie. And those are mostly going to be the actors and the directors. So I don't really think this really applies. Most people do know the main actors and the directors in the movie, and they understand some backstory typically in what's going on. I don't know about The Princess Bride because I watched that years ago. But the point I'm making still applies here. My opponent hasn't contested the actual points I'm making here, which is that the goal of art is to communicate this message that we have to understand the author to understand. And because of that, when we don't understand the author, we're missing the very goal of art.
Once again, none of his arguments say that it's impossible to separate the two. He keeps coming back and saying, we're really missing the point of art. We're not doing it the way Leo Tolstoy wants us to. There's a lot of precious information we're not getting. All of this links back to the same response of ideal versus possible. The ideal experience is Noah describing. Let him advocate for that all he wants. I'm not really here to disagree with that. What I'm here to disagree with is the resolution that we're debating, which is that art cannot be separate. So up until the moment that Noah's willing to take a position that we can't separate the two, there's no room for me to really offer additional responses. So as we give that observation, understand the refutation that I'm giving is not precious to the con side. It is simply a buffer to fill the time that we have left after we've already established the fact that it's possible to separate. So let's step down. First, he says real work destroys separation as he talks about Leo Tolstoy. Okay, this is a nice poetic opinion, but it's actually not true for all art. Think back to, for example, in the film era of Italian neorealism, when instead of just following the conventional norms of here's the artist, we want him to be exonerated alongside the art, many artists would actually be intentionally anonymous because they wanted to be counter-conventional. They didn't want to be like other artists in the past that put their name out. So Tolstoy speaking for all artists everywhere is already just probably not really a thing. But additionally upon that, it doesn't matter. You can still appreciate, even if an artist hasn't put complete separation out, you can still appreciate the art before you know the author. And once again, if Noah's argument is actually true, what it's saying is that it is impossible to separate the artist from the art, and that you cannot actually experience the art until you know the producer behind it. But Noah conceding that he appreciates a film like The Princess Bride, and yet he still doesn't know the producer or director, the main people involved, is an illustration of that concession. Second, he says, yeah, but you're still missing information. Look, he literally says the words, yeah, this is far from ideal. This is the whole point. The resolution doesn't say the best way to experience art is when it is conjoined with its artist. It doesn't say art typically should be appreciated alongside its artist. It says art cannot be separate. It is a statement of possibility, and Noah has not disagreed with that. So once again, none of his arguments link to it. Last thing is he says, well, we're not looking at the extras. We're looking at the main person behind the creative force. My response is the concession applies. Noah can't just not name the extras or the actors even, or even the main protagonist. He can't name the director. He can't name the producer. And I'm not trying to guilt Noah for that. I think it's totally reasonable. In the same way that I think it's reasonable to experience art before we know a lot about the creative forces behind it. So once again, Noah can continue to talk about why it's more ideal to experience art alongside information of its creator, but he hasn't addressed the issue that it's possible to experience the art as a form itself. You don't gotta know who made it to like what you saw.
Okay, so first of all, I do now know who was the director and the producer of The Princess Bride. Rob Reiner and Andrew Steinman, if anybody's interested. So yeah, I know that now. But anyway, I don't think that's relevant to the case for the reasons I provided. Now let's say that we have an example. Let's say we have a football game. And the goal of a football game is to make points. If we were to have a football game where everybody just ran around and tossed the football around, they did all this downs thing, but they never counted up a point, we'd be missing football. We would be missing the whole point behind the football game. We wouldn't be doing it at all. It'd be a fruitless exercise. When we aren't achieving the goal of something, we're not doing it right. And when we don't have the artist and we don't look at the artist, we're messing up the whole goal of art. And that's the point I'm making here. When we aren't achieving the goal of something, we're messing it up. So it is not possible to separate the art from the artist, because doing so means that we're going to miss the very point of art. And when we do that, we're missing the goal and we're missing the whole reason behind it. So my opponent, again, focuses just on this whole idea of it's ideal versus possible, but he hasn't actually engaged with the arguments that I've provided. The point that the goal of art is to do this whole thing of engaging meaning, engaging emotion, engaging feeling. And when we have that lacking, when we don't have the artist, we can't have that. We can't actually get the intent, and we can't actually get the full meaning behind the art. We can get maybe snitches and snatches of it, but that's not achieving the goal behind the art. So my opponent goes back and talks about this whole idea of anonymous art and how people can be anonymous, like the people in the Italian, I forgot, like hyper-realist or surrealist. Yeah, I'm not really familiar with Italian film. But I have two responses to this whole idea of the artist being anonymous. First, we do lose meaning. We can and do lose meaning when artists go completely anonymous. That's just a fact, and it's unfortunate. As I talked about with Homer, we lost a lot of meaning to Homer's work because we don't know who Homer was. Secondly, it's in certain cases, however, it can imbue meaning in the work. People have done this, as he points out, for the purpose of imbuing meaning in the work. And that's where the whole point comes from. They were doing this anonymous for the purpose of first communicating this message. And so the artist absolutely does still matter here. He's doing a thing that's specifically designed to include meaning. For sure, that's the point of the art, and that's what he's doing in the art. So this is still, regardless of what my opponent says about this ideal being possible, because we aren't achieving the goal of art without the artist, it's definitely something that we can't hold up as still achieving the purpose of art.
Okay, so Noah's end position is this, is that the entire goal of art is just to appreciate the feelings that the author, that the creators put into it. That's very questionable, because the actual goal of art is to evoke an emotional response, not necessarily to be all buddy-buddy with the creator behind it. I mean, guys, I don't know if you know, but Picasso was actually kind of a bad guy. He was a womanizer. He went through like 7 women just like that. I mean, Ernest Hemingway lived a really patchy life. If what Noah's really saying is true, like to speak categorically for what the goal of art is, I feel like is really questionable, that we should just all be like really close and uptight with the author's feelings. I don't think that that's really the goal, but it doesn't matter. Even if it were, Noah has already violated his own standard. Now, I mean, he tells you literally at the beginning of the speech, now I know who he is. And the fact is, what I want to add on to that is, it doesn't at all change whether or not Noah liked the film. Noah was able to appreciate the film, The Princess Bride, before and after he knew it, because art is capable of standing on its own. So no matter what you come back to, the fact that the only person in this debate round capable of imbued with the responsibility of affirming the res has already dropped it, has already said, yes, I appreciated a film that was as good as anonymous in my brain, that I did not know the author behind or the artist of. That's the most critical concession in the round, and it absolutely has meaning. Okay, so just on this football analogy, just to provide some extra clarity, he's saying, if people were running around and missing the point of football, that would be, they wouldn't be playing football because they'd be missing the point of it. Well, this is a little bit different, because we're not, when we say the point of football, we're talking about the rules and how it's played. And the rules, or how art is played, is just simply to evoke an emotional response. As Noah illustrates, you can have that positive emotional response of, I like this movie, regardless of whether or not you know the film. So already the analogy just delinks because it's not being properly applied. But just to counter this analogy even further, a better example would be a resolution like, football games cannot be won without a 0 to double-digit shutout. In other words, you have to really beat the team to really win. And what I've said is, there's probably less ideal ways to win, maybe by a 3-point margin, you kick a game-winning field goal. And what Noah's saying is, yeah, but the whole point is to win by really big margins. So if you don't win by that, then you're not really winning at all. And that's what I'm coming back and saying, is that no, Noah's saying this is the more ideal way to experience art, but he's not actually saying that it is not possible to experience art. So to summarize, first, the idea that the entire goal of art is to appreciate the author, I mean, that's an interesting art theory. It's questionable at best, but it doesn't prove the resolution true, because you can still interact, appreciate, enjoy, consume, even evaluate art before you knew who made it. I mean, we all look at modern art. There's like this one picture of a red square that's like a 2-dimensional image of some Russian peasant, and it's just a red square. We can evaluate that as pretty basic, simplistic art, even before we knew who made it. We do this all the time, so it's not at all unnatural to negate the res.
My entire position comes down to one point. Basically, that we can achieve emotion and we can evoke emotion without the artist. And he says basically the purpose of art as a whole is to evoke emotion. And I agree with him, but there's one question he hasn't answered here. Who decides what emotion? Who decides what emotion we're trying to evoke? Is it just the audience saying, I'm going to look at this piece and feel angry, or is it somebody trying to create this piece to communicate a feeling or to communicate an emotion here? And this is where I think we become really clear on the fact that the purpose of art is to communicate something that the author wants us to. The artist creates this art for the purpose of communicating a message and creating a feeling among us that we can't get without him. So my opponent says that we can have emotion, we can enjoy something without understanding the whole point about the creator. But we can't get the point of the art. We can't get the meaning behind it without understanding and following the author and the artist in this case. My opponent responds to this whole point about football by, again, going back to the ideal versus possible point. He's saying here that I have to prove that the whole point of football is to win by some enormous shutout. The point I'm making here is football can't be separated from the actual point of getting it, which is making points. We can't separate those two out. It just doesn't work. We have to be, in order to understand football, we have to be making points. In order to understand art, we have to get what the author is intending. And the only way to get what the author is intending, what the artist is intending, is actually to understand what the artist is trying to communicate. In order to do that, we have to have the artist. Art can't be separated from the artist, because if we do so, then we're sacrificing the very goal and the very point of all his works.
Real quick question. Is there any art in the world that's anonymous?